So welcome everyone to the author chat and the walk through Choctaw history and culture. I'm so excited for everyone to join in here. We've got people from various places. I think everyone's pretty much muted, but if you don't mind, go ahead and mute. And if you have any questions, I'm going to open it up at the end and everyone can unmute, and that way we can do just like if we were in person. You can raise your hand and ask questions, or if you'd rather not do that on audio, you're welcome to drop questions in the chat and we will get to those at the end. So I'm just going to start off with an introduction. I think most of y'all know me, but Halito, Sahosafoyet, Sarah Elisabeth Sawyer, Texas, Amitali, Choctaw Hoke. Hi, my name is Sarah Elisabeth Sawyer, and I am from Texas, and I am Choctaw. I'm a tribal member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. And again, welcome to this author chat. I'm just going to take you guys through my books that I've done. I call them my Choctaw Heritage books, and I've done 7 of them now published that goes through a wide variety and timeline of Choctaw history and culture. So I'm really excited about that. We're going to, let me, you know what, I think I can, well, so anyway, just as people come in, I may pause and mute rather than muting everybody, because I want you guys to be able to chime in as we go along or at the end. But I'm going to give it just a couple of more minutes as people are coming in. So before I get into the Choctaw history and culture, I did want to share a little promo for my other book series. I know this is going to be backwards, but this is my Doc Beck series. It's Westerns, not short stories, they're novellas, but they're short books. And as you can see, the covers all look very much alike. We're done by one of my fantastic author friends, Molly Reeder. And so this is a series that I have, and I'm actually, my phone Siri just wanted to talk to me when I said series. I actually started writing book 5 today. And I know I sent out in my newsletter that my brother had surgery, shoulder surgery, everything went well. Thank you guys so much for thoughts and prayers. And I did want to go ahead and update. It went well. He's going to be in recovery. Yes. Thank you, Margaret. And I did get your email earlier. Thank you. So it was a bit of an odd day for me. I didn't actually go to the surgery. My mama did. And I was holding down the fort and taking care of meals and work. But it was just kind of a prayerful time. And I thought I would get started on that book sometime this week. And I just felt that inspiration. Her alarm was off at 4:45. They were up and out at 5:30 this morning. And I decided to go ahead and get up and do my morning routine and settle in on the couch. And I write by dictation now, all by dictation. So just dictated about 1,200 words. And it felt so good to be back to writing, because I haven't done fiction writing in a while. So very excited about that. Excited to bring the next 4 Doc Beck books in 2022 is the goal. I am going to get into the Choctaw history and culture now. A lot of people ask me if my books are nonfiction or are they fiction. And I always tell people they're heavy on the fiction and they're heavy on the history. So I do a ton of research for each of the books. My mama does a ton of research. She's actually been my inspiration in our Choctaw history and culture. She's been studying and researching our own family history for over 30 years. And we have been able, people are always asking, how do y'all know so much about your family history? It's because of all the things that she and my brother, who had the surgery today, dug, all the things that they have dug out in research and archives, and just relentless in researching our family history and in Choctaw history and culture in general. So been very grateful for that heritage and that history that's been passed on. And I want to pass it on through my books, because it's not available in mainstream culture. Most people don't know what's in my books on Choctaw history and culture. This allows them to learn it in an entertaining way. So not just school books or facts, but actually in stories that they can absorb and take in a very personal way and experience that with people. My first book that I did most people are familiar with. If you're on my newsletter, you got a free e-copy of this, Touch My Tears, Tales from the Trail of Tears. I did that with 9 other Choctaw authors. The interesting thing about my first book is it actually wasn't my book. It wasn't all my writing. And I love that. I love that I was able to share my first book experience with these other authors that 3 of them actually passed away since we did the anthology, 3 of our Choctaw elders who shared their stories in there. And I just feel so honored and privileged that they're preserved in Touch My Tears, because 2 of them did it. They based it on their family story. A lot of the stories in the Trail of Tears stories, Choctaw stories from that time period, were from the perspective of young people or children, because those are the ones that were able to pass that down to the generation who then were able to write and record them or continue passing them down. So that's what is interesting in Touch My Tears, I think, is there's a lot of youth, a lot of young people in there. And so the Trail of Tears began, well, you could go way back in the history of when it began, but the official removal process began on September 27th, 1830, with the signing of the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. And I always remember that date because that's my birthday, September 27th. And I remember whenever I first saw that and just that connection and the significance of, that that's the day that treaty was signed. We actually had the opportunity to see that treaty and several other treaties when we were in DC at the National Archives, whenever I was in the National Museum of the American Indian Artists and Leadership Program. That's actually what sponsored, that program's what sponsored the book and gave me the resources and the material to be able to put that collection together. But it involved a 2-week research trip to Washington, D.C., which was absolutely fantastic. We had guides everywhere we went. We went jaywalking across Independence Avenue, and it was great. We had a phenomenal experience going into the archives and actually handling the documents. And they're like, these belong to the people. These, take all the pictures you want, use the pictures however you want, because they belong to the people. The only thing we couldn't do when we were viewing the treaties was actually touch them on that. The other papers in the National Archives we were able to actually handle. And my mom got a paper cut from a 1805 document that she was so proud of. So that paper cut. But in the National Archives, we were able to take pictures of the treaty. Her photography, which I'll just side slide here. She is an artist as well, with photography, filmmaking, and jewelry making. Her photography, we are thrilled. Some of those photos of the treaties are now in the new Sky Tower at the Choctaw Resort in Durant at the 1832 Steakhouse that has its own staircase up to the steakhouse and its own elevator. It's super, super cool. It's in one of the private dining rooms and then just in the general dining room. So I'm so proud of her, that her photography and those treaties are now in there for the people to view. That's with Touch My Tears, though. So whenever I came back to DC, I gathered these other Choctaw authors, and we actually put this project together in under a year, which, looking back at it, again, Dana and I were talking a little bit earlier about just having to put things aside and just push through. And this was one of those projects that so many people were a part of. We had black and white illustrations, just wanted to really enhance people's experience as they were traveling across the Trail of Tears. That way they can understand what this book, I think, does is it takes people through a grief process of, there is a lot of hurt and, anger and, just everybody that reads it, no matter what your nationality or your background, it's painful in some points. And what these books, I hope, do is it takes you as a reader through that to the other side, to the hope and healing that is there as we learn our history and the faith that brought our ancestors across the trail and to where they rebuilt the Choctaw Nation to what it is today. That's Touch My Tears. A part of that is a continuation of that is my book Toshba Story. What's fascinating about this, and I was talking about youth, that we have a lot of their stories from the Trail of Tears because that was that age that then those stories were preserved. Toshba, similar to that, he later took the English name of John Culberson. his son, James, was a prolific Choctaw writer and served in different capacities prior to statehood and during statehood. And on Toshpa's deathbed, he had told his son the story, and he encouraged him to write it if he thought it would be a benefit to mankind. And so James Culberson did write that. It ended up in the Sequoia National Research Center in Little Rock, Arkansas. My mom found that in the archives there, and she pulled out that story. We just called it the James Culberson manuscript. And when she read that, she was like, "We've got to put this in a book. People need to read this story." And so we did the short version of it for Touch My Tears. And I just knew after going through the manuscript that Toshpa needed his own story. He needed his own book. And I'm so grateful I persevered and got that one done, even though I had several other projects that I could have been working on and wanted to. His party actually removed after the main body of removals in 1831, 32, and 33 is when the official removal was, through some of the worst record-breaking winters in history, which I found that in an Arkansas newspaper said it was the worst winter in history in I think it was the 1832 removal. Toshpa, they removed in 1834. They removed themselves as a band of about 100. Conchi, who was Toshpa's father, was a fantastic leader. It just really blew my mind when I read his story in the actual manuscript and the things that his father did and said that propelled the band forward to make it all the way to their new home, and for Toshpa to make it all the way to his new home, and the journey that he underwent for that, and then what his life ended up being. So that's in Toshpa's story. Again, they were moved in 1834. So one of the things I haven't covered is, well, I'd say that in Touch My Tears, we did cover all the way through the 1850 removals. We consider that part of the Trail of Tears as well, because a lot of the Choctaws who tried to remain in Mississippi, because they were provided in the treaty that they could have U.S. citizenship and land if they remained, the ones that wanted to keep the tribe together and keep sovereignty removed to Indian Territory. So the ones that remained in Mississippi to apply and make their claim, a lot of their claim papers ended up in supposedly in the alcoholic agent's fireplace. And so most of them did not get their land and their claims. And so about in the 1840s and 50s, a lot of them removed themselves on out to Indian Territory and the Choctaw Nation so that they could join the tribe there and have the common lands there. Also, I haven't done this story. There is a new film out that was, I believe, produced by the Choctaw Nation with Mark Williams, and it is on a later removal, what's considered the last removal around 1904, around 1900, and it was for the Dawes Commission when everyone was enrolling for the Dawes, and it was kind of the last opportunity for Mississippi Choctaws to get land if they wanted to come out and try to get individual land allotments in Oklahoma. So they, a lot of them removed or came out and tried to make claim. The story goes that there was actually some unscrupulous businessmen who brought over Mississippi Choctaws and tried to make claim on their land and kept them locked up in a warehouse and all of these things. So this is a lot of history that was recently uncovered with the Choctaw Nation Historic Preservation Department. So I'm wanting to actually include that in my other series, which I'm about to introduce here as we move through the time period, but that's considered like the last of the removal or the last of the Trail of Tears. So a lot of people think the Trail of Tears was one event in 1 year, when really it was spread over multiple years, decades, generations, even of our people being removed from our homelands in Mississippi. So, and guys, if you're like drinking out of a fire hose as I'm going through this, I try not to speak too fast. You might tell I'm passionate about sharing this history and culture, but just flag me in the chat or anything if I need to slow down. Also, as I'm going through this, feel free to, if you think of something that you want me to cover more in depth, a time period or a particular story, just let me know, and I'll try to circle back around to that if we have time. So I kind of set up about the Dawes Commission, the Indian allotments around 1900, which actually began in the 1890s, which is the setting for my Choctaw Tribune series. The Executions is the first one, which is available. Here's my plug. It's available for free on all retail outlets as an ebook. This book, really the catalyst for it, and you can see the photograph on the front is an actual historical photo. And that's something I did with all of the Choctaw Tribune. I had these historical photos that I'm familiar with that, again, mainstream doesn't know anything about these events or wouldn't recognize these photos at first glance the way that I do whenever I see them at the Choctaw Museum or something. But this photograph is what's known as the last Choctaw execution. And tradition goes that in the old Choctaw Nation, and this goes back to right before removal, that we didn't have jails, we didn't have we didn't have, jails that are prisons. The way it worked is the Choctaw Light Horsemen would, if someone was accused of a crime, they would arrest them, try them, and convict them. And the Choctaws only had two punishments, whipping or death. And if it was whichever one it was, well, then the Light Horsemen carried that out. If it was an execution for taking someone's life, and the Choctaw or the one that was found guilty would actually be allowed to go back home, bring in a crop, play a game of stickball, whatever it is, whatever last bit of business they want to take care of, and then actually show up for their own execution on the appointed day. And the tradition goes that no Choctaw ever failed to show up, which that's just a unique piece of Choctaw history. Whenever I learned that, and I learned that story, that I really latched onto. There's actually a story like that in Touch My Tears, written by James Masterson, who is an unbelievable writer. But that's what this photograph is. So in the 1890s, you had a lot of upheaval. You had the Senator Dawes coming in and wanting to break the tribal lands up by individual allotments, whereas before that we held them lands in common. And so it was, if you wanted to fence off however many acres, as long as you were producing on it, you were running cattle or farming it, you could take in as many acres and be productive. It was held in common. With the individual allotments, it's everyone was going to get their own piece of land, own section of land, to supposedly divide it evenly, which what ended up happening is a lot of the Choctaws who were very content just living on 1 acre or something had their lands swindled essentially after they received them. But as during that time, of course, there was a lot of upheaval because you had factions in the tribe that they were for that. They were for Oklahoma statehood. They were for individual land allotments. And then you had factions that were completely against it. They wanted 100% tribal sovereignty. They wanted, at that point, I think one of the censuses is only 1 in 4 people in the Choctaw Nation were Choctaw, and the rest were non-Choctaws. So they had this very, huge influx, and the people supposedly could only be there by permission of the Choctaw Nation. They had to get permits to work there or to have a business there, except the outlaws, they didn't bother with any permits or anything. You think True Grit time period, Indian Territory, it was that kind of thing. And that was one of the reasons why the ones who were for individual land allotments and statehood is they were tired of these outlaws coming in, that they couldn't prosecute them, they couldn't arrest them, they couldn't punish them the way that they could if it was an Indian, because the law enforcement, it was very complicated. And I have, even in my books, whenever I'm trying to explain the differences between if an Indian or a Choctaw committed a crime versus if it was against another Indian, then the Indian police took care of it, or the Choctaw Light Horsemen. If it was committed against a white person, then here comes the federal, agents to deal with it, or the U.S. Marshals. If it was a white person that committed a crime against an Indian, then it was the U.S. Marshals that had to come in. So it just depended on who it was that perpetrated it and who it was perpetrated against, of who had jurisdiction. And there was a lot of confusion in that sense. The U.S. Marshals, of course, would come in. The most famous is Bass Reeves, which I'm a fan of, and I know a lot of people aren't familiar with his story, but he was just had an unbelievable career as a lawman. So I actually have him in a couple of my books as well as an ongoing character. So in the background of all of that, you have the U.S. government trying to push in with the Dawes Commission, trying to push in against tribal sovereignty, against Choctaw sovereignty. We have what's known as the last execution with, and I won't go into detail in that story. You guys can go read it. There's controversy on, how it actually went down. But basically, this Choctaw in the upheaval, this or rather group of Choctaws was accused of murdering political opponents, because back then, if they didn't agree with their political adversary and stuff, it usually resulted in a fist fight or a shooting. And so everyone, after I think it was like a 2-year process, most everyone had been let off except for one man. And they convicted him and sentenced him to execution. And he was allowed to leave and show up on the day of his execution. And there was a big debate on, would he show up? Was that just in the old ways of the Choctaw Nation? Did that still apply? And then you had the federal government that was actually intervening in that case, saying the Choctaws didn't have the right to carry out an execution. They didn't have the jurisdiction or the authority to do that. So it was really, it was beyond just a single crime. It was at the very fabric of sovereignty and what legal and jurisdiction rights did the Choctaw Nation have? Were they still sovereign, or was it the federal government and up to them for that? So in the end, the Choctaw did show up for his execution, and that's why it's considered, and that's what this photograph is, and that's why it's considered the last Choctaw execution, because at that point the federal government was like, you're done. So that's actually what this photograph is. And so I wanted to use that. That was the inspiration for launching this series, or this book, was that time period, and what I really wanted to cover in the political controversies, because it's very complex. It's not like, if I lived back in that time, I don't know what side I'd been on or what I would have done, because it was, it was a very heavy time, and there was a lot of upheaval. But through that, what I like to bring out with the fictional characters is, again, that hope and that healing, and that sense that to stand for truth and justice no matter what. And so that's, if you guys have read the Executions of the Choctaw Tribune series, it centers on a fictional Choctaw family, the Tellers, with Ruth Ann and Matthew, who Matthew has some mom super fans, and they're like, he's closely guarded. Like at one point, I told my mom, I was like, well, Matthew may not pull through this, and she didn't like get it at first. I was like, no, really, and then she was like, don't you dare. Don't you dare kill off that character. So he's a very protected character, and he shows up later. So he owns this newspaper, controversial because he doesn't take sides in all the political upheaval, but rather focuses on telling all sides of the story and letting people make judgments for themselves. And the main character is actually Ruth Ann through most of the books, but Matthew is a very dominant character with that. So she runs the Choctaw Tribune with her brother, and of course always worried that he's going to get himself killed with it. So the first book is really a growing and maturing for her. The second book, Traders, we just go along with the same themes. This is one of my most favorite historical locations ever, and that's one of our original council houses. It still exists. It's now our museum at Tuskahoma. So if you ever get to Oklahoma, make it to Tuskahoma and walk these halls, because every time I walk the hall there, the ceiling's 20 foot tall whenever you're going in that entryway. And just when I do that, I think of all the Choctaw statesmen. I think of all of the people who have walked those halls for court cases and for tribal sovereignty and taking care of tribal businesses. My own fourth generation grandfather walked those halls as a lawyer for the Choctaw Nation. He served in many other capacities as well. So just whenever I walk that hall, and then I go up the stairs. I like taking the stairs. There is an elevator, which is cool, but I like taking the stairs and getting to the first landing and then just turning around and looking back down that hallway and thinking about all the Choctaw business that was taken care of there, and just such a transitional time for our people. So that's in that location is featured in Traders. Shaft of Truth. So this, and I see, is Mike still on here? I saw Mike Cathy was on here. So this is the Dubusky County Courthouse. Mike is a historian who's done a lot of preservation work in the Choctaw Nation. They are working to, and have restored this building in McAllister, Old Town McAllister. So if you're ever there, that's a great, I don't know if it's open all the time, but you can let me know and I can get you in contact with Mike. But it's a really cool courthouse. It's actually an old farmhouse. We call it a courthouse. It's, it was served as the Dubusky County Courthouse, but it's an old farmhouse. So that plays, and McAllister plays a huge role in something that very few people, I think, know about, and that's the mining industry in the Choctaw Nation during that time period, which had a rocky start. So, and then on through the 1890s, where you had a lot of European immigrants working in the Choctaw Nation. And I found that just really fascinating, that they were immigrants to the United States, and then they were immigrants to the Choctaw Nation. So you had Polish, Russian, German, French, Italian. The Italians play a large role in this. So you have all of these people, all these ethnicities that are just in this melting pot of the Choctaw Nation. And I think a lot of Choctaws weren't entirely sure, well, a lot of them weren't sure about it. And a lot of them were against the coal mining industry in general, because it was stripping resources from the Choctaw Nation. It was taking those resources out and being, lining a few individuals' pockets is what they saw it as. So there was a lot of opposition to it. And then there was the coal miners themselves, and they went on strike at one point, and the Choctaw Nation called in the federal troops, and this big upheaval, because it was considered the most dangerous job in the United States at that time, because we all know coal mining, especially in that time period, was dangerous. Coal mining in Indian Territory was extra dangerous. There were no regulations, no oversights, nothing, and just a lot of unskilled miners, as opposed to like the Pennsylvania miners and stuff. They had skilled people who came from Europe, especially England, Brits, that had experience working in the coal mines. And these were just, ones that had come from New York and were just trying to make a way, and they couldn't make their way there. So they came on out to the Choctaw Nation and really took some dangerous jobs. So, and there was a lot of accidents. So all of that's covered in there through the story of Matthew. So that he's actually the main character in that book, where he goes to the coal mining country on a personal quest. And so that's covered in Shaft of Truth. Did a lot of research on coal mine operations and mining shafts and all those good things. Sovereign Justice. This is the newest book this year. Finally got it released. I'd been working on it since 2017 at least, and put it aside to do the Code Talker book, which we'll get to here shortly. One of the things I love, so I'll just say this before I forget, on the background of each one of these actually is really fun. Executions is a background map of Indian Territory. So we've got Scullyville and different ones that you can actually see on the map. This includes the World's Fair, which I don't think I mentioned that. Chicago World's Fair. The character Ruth Ann goes there. So in the background is actually a pamphlet from the World's Fair that a friend of mine gave me whenever I was working on the book. So we digitized that, and the cover designer was able to work that into the background. On Shaft of Truth, not as exciting, just a kind of a standard mine shaft with the kind of like a sunlight coming up through it. This one, though, is the one that I just am most thrilled about in the background here. This is actually the treaties that we were talking about earlier. So in the background, that's one of the photographs that my mother took at the National Archives with the treaties, and it bleeds over to the back. So here's the actual image. don't know if you can see it, but if you got the paperback copy, you can see there, I know this is backwards, but at the bottom here is Pushmataha. They didn't spell his name correctly, but that's his mark. And on the side of it says Great Metal Minkos or Chiefs. So this is the cover that, and I almost forgot that we were going to do, because I was trying to think, I was like, what are we going to put in the background? What are we going to put in the background? And then it just like hit me like a lightning bolt. I'm like, duh, we're going to put this because this is where the main character goes to Washington, D.C. So we move out of the Choctaw Nation almost entirely for this book. So we have a picture of the U.S. Capitol from that time period. And so this one really dives in to, there was a lot of Choctaws. I don't know a lot of people realize this too, but there was a lot of Choctaws that went to Washington, D.C. from the very beginning. And so this was to represent those that went there as delegates. They went there to testify on the floor of Congress, to advocate, to lobby for the Choctaw Nation, for the treaties that hadn't been fulfilled, surprisingly, and just all of the things that were going on in all of the decades, but most especially during that, as they were facing the Dawes Commission and Senator Dawes, as they were facing the Dawes Commission and Senator Dawes with the potential dissolving of the Choctaw Nation. So that with Ruth Ann, and she's dealing with a very personal situation and tragedy, which I won't give any spoilers on that, because if you haven't read book 3, there's a huge twist in the middle of book 3 that sets her on the path for this in book 4. So that is actually my longest book, because it does involve, going from Choctaw Nation to Indian Territory. There's some romance in it. So those that are like, where's the romance? It's in this book. And Matthew will have his story in book 5. So spoiler on that. I'm working on book 5 with that. But I really enjoyed doing that. I enjoyed it, especially because I've been to Washington, D.C. twice now doing research for Choctaw history and culture. So I got to relive some of that. Ruth Ann is a tiny little spoiler here. She goes and sees the treaties as well. So I got to relive that experience of going and seeing the treaties through Ruth Ann and their delegation going and doing that. Let's see, was there something else I was going to make sure I covered on that? So that kind of, is really Jefferson Gardner was just being elected as chief, and his policy was basically ignore the Dawes Commission during that time. So, there was just a lot of that upheaval, and I wanted to cover that without getting too, eyes glazed over with the historical details. So, I think that's a balance as a historical fiction author of how much history do you put in there, how much do you, fictionalize it, and not even fictionalize, but just how do you present it in a way that people still find it entertaining and engaging without marring the historical details. All of my books go through the Historic Preservation Department. They very graciously read them for me. They don't do that, just as an open policy, but they do go through mine and give me feedback. And so I've always really appreciated that, to check those little details and nuances to make sure that I'm being as accurate as I can. And I know with Sovereign Justice, we had a discussion of, what were the laws when it came to justice and crime and punishment. And it's still confusing. I feel like we're still unraveling it today. One other shout out I do want to give on Sovereign Justice is Margot, who lives near Washington, D.C. And I know she was super confused reading it because, and I'll just point this out for those who are familiar with DC, the street names and locations have changed. And so as you're going through it and you're like, that's not where that is. That doesn't make sense. So they were different in 1894, which is when this book took place. So I had to actually go with a historical map next to a Google map and try to match them as best I could while using the historical street names, and then put a note in there. So if anyone is familiar with that area and they want to detangle that, go for it. I can send you the historical map that I based that on, because it got really confusing. And I'm kind of directionally challenged. So whenever I'm looking at it and trying to describe something in writing, it's like I have to draw myself a map to make sure I'm not getting confused. I especially did that in Mission Bandits in the Doc Beck series, so because it takes place in an old style Spanish mission in New Mexico. So I had to, where are the walls, where are the buildings, where's the chapel, where's the storeroom. And in my first draft, it was just all jumbled up and mixed up. So I actually drew myself a map of here's the courtyard, here's all these things, so that I could go through and correct the details. So I'm not detail oriented. Whenever I write my first drafts, I just slap it on there. But whenever I go back through it, I try to make sure those details are accurate, because whenever you guys are reading it, I want, for me, this is the only way some people are learning anything about Choctaw history and culture. And if it's not accurate, why do it? So I don't want to contribute to any stereotypes, which I have something I like to do, and I don't have it in here with me, but I have a drum. I'm not going to do it with a mic, so that'll just sound weird. But where you do that boom, 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 and I'm like, what tribe is that? And people guess stuff, and I'm like, it's the tribe of Hollywood producers. So, and I don't want to contribute to any of that. And some of the, not all of it, I'm not throwing out all of those, but I want to be accurate. And the only way for me to do that is a lot of times is go back to primary source material, because even books that have been written on Choctaws, it contains so much inaccuracy and stereotypes and, one-sided perspectives. So going back to those original documents is vital to me. And that's going to lead me into my last book. Before I do that, though, I know we've got a few things in the chat, so I'm just going to take a look of that. Yes, that again, thank you guys. Allison mentioned about praying for healing for my brother who had major surgery, shoulder surgery today. He came through it well, and we're getting him on the path to recovery. Elizabeth, you live near DC and you love visiting the National Museum of the American Indian. So I think I glossed over that. I said NMAI. That's the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of the American Indian there in DC. There's one in New York, but I was in the program with the one in DC, which I actually didn't get to spend very much time actually at the museum because we had so many other places that we were visiting. Allison, is my mom's work for sale? It is. So, and especially the treaty one is for sale as a fine art print. You can go to my website, SarahElisabethWrites.com, and I'll just drop it in the comments here, because it's Sarah with an H, Elizabeth with an S, not a Z, Writes, WRITES. I always have to spell it for everyone because I have that unique spelling, but you can go to that and go to the shop section, and her art is in there. However, we're hoping to launch in the next few weeks. I keep saying that, I've said that for months now, but we are hoping to launch our new website. I'll still have my author website, but we're hoping to launch ChoctawSpirit.com very soon. And that is going to be more focused on her art. So, and I will have my books on there, but really focusing. And we have had, oh my goodness, we've had the Choctaw Spirit. I started a blog on that like in 2009, I think it was 2009 when I started a Choctaw Spirit blog. It's not active anymore, but I was trying to record some of our research journeys on there. And so yeah, we're working on actually getting that launched. So we've been working on putting that together. Thank you, Linda, from Margot. Miami, Oklahoma, lots of mining there, Dana. That's interesting. Yeah, and when you go to McAllister and Krebs, and I actually literally got the keys to the Ludi Coal Mining Museum in Ludi, Oklahoma. But it's just this old farmhouse. I guess it's still there. I hope it's still there. But I finally tracked down the person that had it, and they have a little thrift shop there that the sales there go toward trying to preserve that museum and that mining history. But we went there and she literally gave me the key. She's like, yeah, the museum's out back in that house there, so y'all just feel free to look around. So yeah, I literally got the keys to the museum. And that's what I love too about research, is a lot of times you get those behind the glass experiences. So you actually get to go in and handle archive, documents at the archives, and see the things that a lot of people, it's available to a lot of people. It's just you have to make the appointments, you have to set things up. So I've been very, very blessed. No spoilers, have not made it to Sovereign Justice yet. Yes, I'm trying not to give any spoilers for Sovereign Justice. Super interesting. Margot said, Dana gets lost in her own backyard. I feel that. I feel that. It's like I've lived in the same county for 26 years and I still use my GPS. So Allison, thanks. Yeah. Jennifer loved all of this. And it's good to see you too, Jen. Jen's fellow Choctaw author there. So, okay. So if you guys have any questions, feel free again to drop those in the chat as I'm getting ready to go to my last book. And it took mega research to complete it. And that is A Knuckle Warrior, Choctaw Code Talkers of World War I. If you've read this book, just drop in the chat and say, yes, I've read it, or that you have it. This, if you have like one book that you're going to do in your life, I would say Touch My Tears was it. And it was my first book. It's fantastic. If I was going to pick a second one, it would be, here I go. I sound like I'm naming off like my favorite child. Like I can't do this because I was like, no, Tushpa Story. And then like, well, the Choctaw Tribune. All right. So I'm not going to name favorites, but A Knuckle Warrior took about 2 years of intense research. And what I found whenever I started it, because to me, whenever I would go and speak, at public events, at libraries and all, I would ask everyone, who's heard of the Navajo Code Talkers of World War II? And everyone would raise their hand because of the movie Wind Talkers, right? I would ask them, who's heard of the Choctaw Code Talkers of World War I? And they were just blank stares. Nobody had ever heard of them, which was just always shocking to me because growing up, someone asked me, he's like, well, when did you learn about the Code Talkers? I said, I don't ever remember not knowing about them. I've always known about their legacy, but they are credited as the first, for those that don't know, they are credited as the first Code Talkers. The Choctaws, there were other tribes in World War I. The Choctaws was the most documented, and it's the one that we actually have a record of the code words that they used, which is fantastic. That book actually took me to France, where I got to go on the battlefields where the Choctaws actually fought. We retraced their step that their unit, their path that unit took, and the battles that they engaged in, which was just an unbelievable experience. I also got to go to the Army Museum there and in Paris, which 10 days in France, I spent a day and a half in Paris, and it was going to the Army Museum to see the portrait of Otis Leader, which, pardon me, I won't give all of that away, but Otis Leader is just one of my, I'm just super fan of his, and he was Choctaw, Chickasaw, Scotch, and Irish, which I'm hoping to do more work on him, actually. I don't have anything solidified yet, but I'm hoping there's going to be a project specifically on him in the near future. So Knuckle Warrior, I wanted to do that story like my whole life. I wanted to write that story. And then in 2016, I realized, I was like, wait a second, the ending of World War I, like the 100-year anniversary, should be like right around here. And so I went and looked up the specific dates, and sure enough, 1918 is when the armistice was signed on November 11th, which we have coming up, Veterans Day, and some people still recognize it as Armistice Day, but that is when the treaty was signed to end World War I. So that I was like, the Choctaw Code Talkers need to be a part of that commemoration. Their story, their narrative needs to be in that commemoration year. So I was like, well, I better get busy. This is end of 2016. So I had no idea what I was getting into. I was like, well, I'll just talk to a few people, gather up some records, and there's the story. And it was nothing like that. I had to do a lot of primary research. I credit Dr. William Meadows hugely. He just put out his nonfiction. I was going to grab it if it was on my shelf closed, but he put out his nonfiction on the Native American Code Talkers in World War I, Dr. William Meadows out of Missouri State University. So he's probably the one that's done the most research. And so, but he didn't have his book out yet. I wish he had. Then I could have just read it and based my novel on those facts. But as it was, I ended up having to dig out so much. I actually found some things though that hadn't been discovered, which shocked me as much as Choctaws have researched the code talkers. I found one of the messages that they actually transmitted. We had that translated into Choctaw using the code words that we knew were established, and for the release of a Knuckle Warrior on, oh, I just realized this is October 27th. That's when they did their code talking. Happy anniversary, everyone. 100 and what we had 103 years later. So that's when we had the release for the book, October 26th, 27th. In there is when they did their code talking. I knew this date sounded familiar for some reason. I can remember the signing of the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek because that was my birthday, but I tend to forget this one. So yes, that at the book signing or the launch for A Knuckle Warrior, we had that message translated into Choctaw, and my mom invited a Choctaw First Speaker, veteran, and color guard member to actually read that message at the launch. And really, given the time difference between us and France, was like almost to the hour of when they would have actually transmitted the message. So that was just like totally, there was just so many God things in all of these books, but especially this book in particular. It was really important, the cover design. I'm very particular about my cover designs. Like I want that they all have things that mean things. This one, this is actually my brother. This is not the one that had surgery today. This is my brother, John. He is also on the cover of, I mean, he's cheap, Choctaw, and handsome. So what can I say? I probably used him up though. But so this is his eyes, and this is my mom's photography. So she actually, it only took like 500 shots to get this just the right look with the glint and everything and the shadowing. This one didn't take quite as many. This is actually her photography as well. The background image and all of that was done by the graphic designer, and he just photoshopped him in there. This is an actual World War I uniform that was worn by a doughboy in France, which was just unbelievable. We've got the Brody helmet. The thing I could not find, I called museums, I called replica shops, I called reenactment rental places, all of this. I could not find this field phone. I couldn't find anything similar. And I was like, it's the code talkers. They transmitted, they didn't have radio. They transmitted by telephone. I was like, we've got to have this telephone. So I finally, my cousin, who I don't think's on here today, but she is a librarian over in Fort Worth near me. That's actually where my mom was born, who knew a World War I private collector. And so she connected me with him. He happened to be also a small guy who wears this uniform for reenactments. He loaned us everything for free, which was unreal. He was just so excited that we wanted to use it and do it. So he had this original, not a replica, this original 1917 World War I field phone. And I was absolutely thrilled to actually have that because it's such a significant part. So I've actually had people, whenever this has gotten posted on World War I groups, who think that this is just a colorized World War I photograph, and these are like historians, and they're like reenactors and everything, and they're like, "Is that colorized a World War I photograph?" And I'm like, "Yes." So anyway, I'll get off of that. But we had a fantastic time doing that. Again, shout out to my family. As you guys can tell, this is not a solo thing that I do on my own or in a vacuum. It's always a team effort. This had over 100 people in the acknowledgments for this book alone, and I appreciate each and every one of them. I know we've got some people on here tonight that were a part of that, and I really, really, really appreciate it. So, code talkers, I could talk. Well, I do. I give entire presentations on just the code talkers, which I might be doing this next month. I'll send that out in my newsletter if that works out. And I'm assuming everyone is on my newsletter list, but if you're not, you can drop your email in the chat and I'll add you to that VIP reader newsletter that I have. And I send out about once a week with just updates and things that are going on. So someone dropped their email, I'll get that. Very cool to hear the details. This has been amazing. Thank you, Dana. So cool to hear the story behind the cover. Thank you, Elizabeth. I know I really geek out on that cover. I'm just so we made a big poster of it to put at the book table and all. And yeah, I love that. Your subconscious planet. Yeah. So Allison said I connected to Matthew and the other stories about the time in the boarding school. My 8th generation great grandfather is Eliza Wheelock, who founded Dartmouth. Oh, wow. That's so cool. Thank you for sharing that, Allison. So Dana was asking, what is Dr. Meadows' book called? I don't know why it's not on my shelf over here because I like keep it right. Oh, there it is. Sorry, I didn't mean to disappear like that. This is Dr. Meadows' book, the first, and I know it's backwards, The First Code Talkers, Native American Communicators in World War I. And that's by William C. Meadows. So Dr. Meadows, or Bill, as has been calling, but the first Code Talkers. And this photograph here, if anyone doesn't know anything about the Code Talkers or very familiar with this historical photograph of the 5 of the original Code Talkers and their commanding officer, who I actually got to meet his daughter, which was amazing. She's in her 90s in Arkansas, and she remembers her father. She was like, oh yeah, that photograph hung in our home all my life. And I was just like, oh. And it was really interesting because I asked if her mother was American Indian because her mother was born in Oklahoma or Indian Territory at that time. And she said, no, if we have any Indian in our family, it would have been on my father's side. So their commanding officer, who was Captain Horner, at that point he was Lieutenant Elijah E.W. Horner. And so he might have been Indian, and that, and I think he really connected with the Code Talkers. He was their commanding officer throughout the whole time period. And after the first battle at St. Etienne, he was the only officer left. And so he was given field commission to take over the Company E, which was the Choctaw Code Talkers, and given a, from what we understand, a field commission as captain. So yeah, that battle, and I actually found James Edwards, who's in this photograph here, who later became a preacher. But I found in the National Archives his report that he wrote on that battle that we didn't have before. And so I was really excited to share that with his family. He said that every time he would hear a shell falling, he would fall down and wait for it to hit, and then he would get back up and keep running. That he felt no fear. But anyway, that's going through the war experience. And in my book, Knuckle Warrior, war and violence, it does have war violence. It's not glorified in any way, but it does have, what they endured just on the battlefield, and then what their contribution did to help bring an end to World War I. I am going to begin wrapping it up there. So Kimberly said, my grandmother 8 times got her land finally awarded by the president, but after she died, that happened so much. That was going to be the Dawes Commission during tribal land allotment. So, which ended in 1907, I believe it was 1906, 1907 with Oklahoma statehood. And that was the end of the Dawes Commission and what they considered the end of tribal sovereignty, which we regained completely in the 1970s. And that's a whole other story, and probably a whole other book series that we'll explore one of these days as we move through the history. I hope you guys enjoyed from 1830s to 1919 with the Code Talkers, this journey through, or this walk through Choctaw history and culture that I've told through my books. That's my goal, is to share that as accurately and as honoring as I can. And I so appreciate each and every one of you and your support as my readers, because without you guys, I couldn't do these books. It's very time consuming. It's hundreds, thousands of hours into it. And so those notes of encouragements and emails, when I say they mean a lot, they truly mean a lot. And I appreciate it. I appreciate getting to share with you all. Yako Ki. And if there's any questions, I'm going to open it up for that. If you want to unmute, raise your hand and ask. or if you've got anything you would like me to follow up on. We've got a couple of more minutes here. I was going to try to keep it about an hour. So if anyone needs to head out, that's great. Yakoki means thank you in Choctaw. So I always want to acknowledge that and share. So it's open if anyone wants to do that. If anyone has any questions or discussion before we wrap it up. See, I know Mike's on here, Elizabeth Bell, welcome. Mary Steimer, it's so good to have you. Jackie, Anne Marie Webster, and then we've got some people that came in just on the phone. So I'm glad we were able to do that. Dana, it's so good to see you. Dana's taken off. Thank you for joining us. That was fantastic. So I think we're wrapping up here if no one has anything else. So again, Yakoki, thank you all for joining in on this, and Chapisa Lachiki, I will see you again soon. Take care.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Allison. It's good to have you.
Good to see you guys for a change.
I know, not just the email thing and everything.
Mm-hmm.